Te hāpore o wakatau. E whakatau mai rā. Nau mai hoki mai ki raro i te manaakitanga o te kaunihera o whakatau. Tēnā koutou. Mauria mai o koutou tēnei mate. O ke atu ki te kaihanga o te kāranga o hene nui te pō. Ki te pō nui, ki te pō roa, ki te pō kāhore. Ko te tatou e te pō i mui a koe. O ke atu ki te kaitiaki. Nō reira, haere atu rā. Tēnā rā koutou katoa, ka tangi au he karakia, he tīmatanga, he tīmata o te hui, o te pō nei, ko kāhu pakipaki toku ingoa, tēnā koutou. Me noi tātou, ka tangi au. Te ākina te rangi, te ākina te hau, te ākina te maunga, te ākina te awa, te ākina te moana, te ākina te whai o te ao, te ākina papa tuanuku, e tuturu whakamaua ki a tīna, haume e hui e, tā ikea. Kia ora rā tātou. Thank you.
Kia ora hui tātou katoa. Thank you for joining us for this meeting. And can I acknowledge how many of you are here, which to me says how much you care about this beautiful city we share. These planning changes we are discussing tonight are the most significant for our city in a generation. We want public input and engagement. There's a huge amount of information online and also the opportunity for e-questions on the website. But not everyone can access these, and some people actually absorb information best orally. I'm a bit old-fashioned. I like engaging with people in person, which is why I initiated the monthly presence of councillors at the Nelson Market, and that in turn, because of the level of concern, has triggered tonight's public meeting. Can I thank Councillor Kahu Pakipaki for the karakia, and can I also introduce the other councillors present? Councillor Matty Anderson, Councillor Trudy Brand, Councillor James Hodgson, Councillor Pete Rainey, Councillor Campbell Rollo, Councillor Tim Skinner, and Councillor Aaron Stallard. Deputy Mayor Rohan O'Neill-Stevens and three of our councillors, Rachel Sanson, Mel Courtney and Matthew Benge, send their apologies because they had prior commitments. Rohan is at a national transport conference in Auckland. All of them are committed to listening. Tonight's proceedings are being recorded and they have each committed to watch that so that they can hear the views that are expressed this evening. And I want to reassure you of our collective commitment to hearing your concerns, being open-minded about the process and the proposed changes that we are discussing this evening. I also want to introduce the Chief Executive of the Nelson City Council, Nigel Philpott, who's been in the role now for 5 months. Group Manager, Environment Management Consents and Compliance, Mandy Bishop. And I also want to introduce Dennis Bush-King, who's one of the Nelson Tasman region's longest serving planning officials, who will also be presenting this evening. The Council has appointed a friend of submitters, Emily Bayliss, and if Emily could stand up, she is the person that the Council has a contract with to help people with their submissions. Can I also acknowledge Nelson MP Rachel Boyack, and also I note Blair Cameron is here. It's strange for me to have Blair on the hard left and Rachel over on the hard right. I am new to the decade-long process that has preceded the notification of Plan Change 29 and the consultation and decisions over the past 2 years by the previous council on the Nelson Tasman Future Development Strategy. I've spent the best part of my first 9 months as Mayor dealing with the aftermath of last August storm. I've given quite a lot of attention to the provisions in Plan Change 29 that enable us to better manage those risks of floods, of landslides and liquefaction in future, and I believe they are necessary. The contentious and most difficult part of these changes is around the intensification of housing. Changes are required because we need more housing. The Tasman Council rightly argues that Nelson is not accommodating our fair share of the region's population growth, and all the new housing cannot be accommodated on the region's highly productive horticultural lands. Now, I openly concede the devil is in the detail on these housing changes, and heard at the Nelson Market last Saturday, politely but very firmly, how concerned people are. The most common complaint I'm hearing is the proposal to allow multi-storey buildings up to 6 stories high without any public notification in residential areas such as the inner city and the centre of Stoke. I want to assure you that we are very open to changes, want to facilitate your input so we get these sorts of issues addressed. Planning rules are always difficult. They define what we're allowed to do on our own property without the expense and the delay of getting resource consents, but also where those impacts are so significant that they need to be publicly notified. And there rightly needs to be different rules in different places. I'm much more relaxed about high-rise buildings in the CBD than I am in residential areas. This is all about getting the right rules in the right place. The format for tonight's meeting is to have a 20-minute presentation on Plan Change 29 from our planning staff. It is large and complex, totalling nearly 1,200 pages with maps. Council wants you to have all the information on it and to empower you to be able to make submissions so we get a good outcome. We're then going to have 25 minutes of questions on any aspect of either the plan change or of the process. We want those questions to be short and pithy so we can get as many answered as possible and make sure you've got as much information. We're then going to have an open floor to comments. This is your opportunity to have your say. We would like to limit contributions to 3 minutes each so that we can hear from as many people as possible. I'd really encourage you, if people say things that you agree with, to applaud. But equally, I would encourage you to be respectful of those you disagree with. We will wrap up no later than 9 p.m, where I and fellow elected members will be available for further one-on-one feedback. The reason we are all here, whether it's council staff, whether it's elected members or member of the public, is that we love the city of Nelson that we share, and we want these planning rules to serve our community well in its future development. Success for me from this meeting would be 4 things. Firstly, for us all to go home better informed about what these plan changes mean. For elected members, for us to be well informed about your concerns, what you like and what you don't like. Thirdly, that people here are free to express their views and have been respected in expressing those views, and that the concerns have been taken on board and that we have a pathway forward to get these changes right. I would now like to invite Mandy Bishop and Dennis Bush-King to give that presentation about the detail of what is being proposed.
Thank you, Mayor Nick. With us tonight is also Rachel Morgan, who is the technical lead for this plan change. So the presentation, 20 minutes, we're probably not going to be able to explain all the detail of the plan change in that time, so really look forward to your questions and comments after the presentation. The presentation will go through the background, what is behind this plan change, what's happened that we've got to this point, the main changes within the plan change, and what part you can play in this process. So first up is Mr. Dennis Bush-King, who is the manager of our environmental planning team.
Thanks, Mandy. And yeah, it's a great turnout. And I think, if I can just go to the first slide, please. I've got the thing over here. That's correct. Yes, right. I saw it moving before. Yeah, why are we doing this plan change? As Mayor Nick said, the housing affordability in Nelson has been an issue. Housing demand exceeds the available supply. So the council over a number of years has tried to see what it can do about improving the supply of housing and the housing choice that is available for residents of this great community. And I guess in part it's been driven by that objective that the councillors have had, but also we've been nudged along by central government through what is called a national policy statement. We are what's called a Tier 2 council, so we're not subject to the same sort of drivers of sort of the big metropolitan areas like Auckland and Wellington, but we still have to do certain things in order to increase housing supply in the city. As has already been mentioned, we've also worked in collaboration with Tasman District on a future development strategy, which is looking out 30 to 50 years in terms of what our community might need to look like in terms of meeting the needs of our future generations, our children and our children's children. So we're trying to strike that balance in order to, achieve the outcomes that we, as a community, we want to achieve, but also in terms of compliance with some of the directions that are coming from central government. In terms of the Plan Change 29, the council was previously involved in doing a draft Nelson plan, and that did go through a consultation process as well. And it did have some provisions for extra housing supply. That plan was sort of parked back in 2021 when the government announced changes to the Resource Management Act. And so the council at the time decided that we needed to proceed with a housing plan change as a sort of a one-off. And so that's the genesis behind Plan Change 29. So there was the draft plan, there was the future development strategy, and now we have Plan Change 29. And that's going through a process now where we are inviting public submission to say whether we've got it right, and as the Mayor said, what is the right balance. And I've been involved in lots of plan change processes over the years, and they always change after notification, and that's because of the contribution that the submitters make to the process. So we certainly look forward to that, and it's a great turnout, and I think if it's representative of the interest, then I would certainly encourage you to make submissions. What we would be looking for in terms of the advice that we need to give to the council, where things probably aren't right and what needs to change, but also in terms of certain outcomes that we might be that are important for the community. We're certainly looking for suggestions from you people as well. So yes, submissions can be focusing on what you don't like or what you do like, but we also want to hear from you in terms of what needs to change and perhaps why, and in terms of what can be done better. So I'll now invite Rachel to just go through some of the details of the actual plan change. Wrong direction.
Thank you, Dennis, and good evening, everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name's Rachel Morgan. I'm a planner and I'm supporting the Nelson City Council preparing Plan Change 29. So I'll just briefly take you through some of the key changes which are included. I won't go through every single detail. There's a lot of you here and I'm sure you are really keen to get into the questions and discussion. So, firstly, in terms of the residential zones, this is really the key part of Plan Change 29. And as Dina said, it really builds on the work that was done through the draft Nelson Plan. So it introduces a general residential zone, a medium density residential zone and a high density residential zone. And that high density residential zone is a step beyond the draft Nelson Plan, but is something that was signalled or is signalled in the future development strategy. And I'll talk through some of those details shortly. A couple of the other changes are Vincent Vanguard, the current industrial area is proposed to be rezoned to inner city fringe, which is really a mixed use sort of zone, which enables residential above ground floor. There's been an increase or proposed to be an increase in heights within the city centre and the other centre zones, really in line with where that Nelson Tasman future development strategy got to. And another key thing which I'll talk through is the design standards and assessment process. And not in too much detail, but this is a really key part of the plan change, and a lot of that detail is sitting in that big lot of documents which is on the website, so I'll just take you through some of the highlights of that. And all of this is really intended, as Dennis mentioned, to really give effect to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which was introduced in 2020 and really sets out some clear parameters for how cities need to plan for long-term growth over the next 30 years. So now just to talk through the zoning. And I know there's a zoning plan up here and there's some at the back as well. So firstly, just talking through the city centre. So the city centre is clearly the most accessible part of the city. It's the focus for employment, civic, recreation, entertainment and social facilities. And in response to that, an increase in height is proposed up to 24 metres, which would enable buildings of generally 6 storeys. The area to the north in the wood, and Dennis will pick up on this shortly, has been excluded from Plan Change 29 for zoning purposes anyway, and that's really responding to some of the natural hazard constraints in that area. The high density residential zone is the area in dark orange that you can see on the screen, and that has generally been applied in areas closest to the city centre, which is really that most accessible part of Nelson. It also applies in those fringe areas as well, in and around Washington Valley. The Nelson South area is also proposed in Plan Change, so I'm just getting a bit of feedback here. Also proposed in Nelson South, and that's really recognising that the area is also close to the city centre, but it also has a range of facilities, hospitals, schools, open spaces, and it's really well connected by public transport to the city centre. Thank you. But as Dennis mentioned, I know there's been a lot of feedback on the high density zone, both in terms of its extent and the types of development or the scale of development that it enables. And we're really keen to hear from you on that through the submission process, because we really are at the start of the journey. And as we go through, we're able to respond to those issues that are raised through submissions. That lighter orange area that you can see is the proposed for medium density residential, and that is generally in line with the future development strategy in those accessible locations that I talked about, and it does start to provide a transition between those higher density areas and then those typical suburban or general residential areas. And the yellow elsewhere is that general residential zone that I mentioned. So then to Stoke, I won't talk through each of the zones, but really just focus in on how it's been applied. So Stoke is obviously the second largest centre outside of the city centre itself. There's a range of services and amenities, good access to open space, good access to schools. And in response to that, the height proposed is 19.5 metres, which in a centre context would provide for about 5 to 6 storeys with commercial at ground floor. The high-density residential zone has been applied closely around that centre, generally within about 400 metres or a 5-minute walk. The medium-density residential is within about a 10-minute walk or about 800 metres from the centre. And Te Hunanui, there's some provision, some provision for medium and high density development around the Te Hunanui Centre, given it's got good accessibility to the centre itself, but also a range of amenities and natural open spaces. But we do acknowledge that the topography in this area is quite challenging from a market perspective to deliver those high density forms of housing, which may tend to limit those high density forms of housing, or what would be delivered. So now just very briefly talking through each of the zones. I'm not going to talk through every line on that table, but just to give you a bit of a sense of it. So the general residential zone, as I mentioned, it's that standard residential area or that typical residential area, and it's reasonably similar to the general residential zone that was in the draft Nelson plan, but also what can be achieved under the current planning rules at the moment. So the intention here is to enable two-storey residential development, but what we're likely to see and what we do see in other cities is that a range of housing types would be delivered. So that would be, that could range from anything from a tiny home, a small infill development at the back of a site, houses, townhouses, and terraced houses as well. So there'll be a real mix delivered over a long period of time. There are a wide range of standards proposed to manage the design of buildings and development on a site, which are listed there. So they really work together to achieve three key things, which is really about delivering attractive and safe streets, attractive and safe street environments, quality living environments for people, and managing those effects to neighbouring sites. Just a key thing to note as well, which just a key thing to note in terms of all the residential zones is that up to 3 residential units is permitted on a site, but where more than 4 or more residential units are proposed on a site, resource consent will automatically be required. And that will trigger the need for a design assessment. And there's a range of design assessment criteria that are included in the plan change, which will really guide that process. So in terms of the medium density residential zone, again, this is quite similar to the general residential zone, except that it does enable 3-storey development to occur. So hence the name medium density residential development. But the key difference here is the height and the height in relation to boundary or daylight envelope, which is enabled, which really enables that 3-storey development. There are also some additional standards that are proposed or slightly different in terms of landscaped area, outdoor living space, outlook space, and that sort of thing. But again, similar to the comments that I made earlier, we are likely to see a range of housing types delivered within the zone. So the point that I'm trying to make there is not every site or not every development will necessarily deliver 3 storeys. We're likely to see a range of housing types delivered. So then just finally, the photos. There are a range of developments around New Zealand. They're really just intended to give a bit of a flavour of the sorts and the types of development that you might see delivered within these zones. They're not intended to be anything more than that, but I think the key point to take away is that again, like what I was saying, a range of housing types will be delivered within these zones. Not everything will be developed right up to the maximum enabled permitted envelope. And that's really consistent with what we see in other cities across New Zealand, where in a high density residential zone, for example, you do still see 2 and 3 storey development in and amongst more high density forms of housing. And that really reflects that there are a range of site sizes, landowner and developer intentions do change, and it just reflects that. So in terms of the standards, the key difference here again is the height and the height in relation to boundary, which again I understand there has been a lot of feedback on that already. So the intention, as the name suggests, is to enable high density residential housing, and those height in relation to boundary standards do reflect that. But the key thing to note there is that, as I mentioned before, 4 or more residential units will trigger the need for a design assessment, which a 6-storey development would. So there's... If it complies with the development controls, yes, that's correct. Yeah. But certainly design and those design aspects are proposed to be a really key focus of that resource consent process.
Excuse me, I'd like to let the presentation complete and then I'll have all the questions in the world. So hold your question, let the presentation be finished, please.
It'll be... Okay. Or just be 2 words. Okay. Okay. I might just leave it there because I know you're all keen to ask some questions. So Dennis has just got a couple more slides and then we'll leave it there.
So Plan Change 29 has some other aspects to it other than just the intensification opportunity. We have taken the opportunity to update a lot of the information around natural hazards so that if certain risks are present on particular sites, then it may trigger the need for some sort of design assessment. There are provisions to allow for sort of minor alterations to existing houses in some cases. But if you want to do substantial developments or substantial redevelopments and you're caught by some of these natural hazard overlays, then that's been provided for. As Mayor Nick said, they cover things like landslip, like river flood exposure, liquefaction and earthquake risk and some of those other types of hazards. And then the other feature of the plan change is we have taken the opportunity to update some of the heritage provisions in the current plan, and that has resulted in some heritage items coming off because of changes or of circumstances. In some cases we have added them on, and then we also have a couple of heritage precincts in the city to recognise the special character of some of our areas. And we have added a new one in the Richmond Ave area, and there have been a couple of other changes in terms of deletions and modifications to fit in with the overall housing plan change. So, how can you contribute? And basically, as I said, the process that we're in now is the council has put out a proposed plan change, and although it sort of works under the sort of procedures of the Resource Management Act, we have to go through a process to invite submissions, and certainly that is what we want to get from you. And the closing date is the 19th of September, and that will then go into a process where we go into what's called further submissions. So the staff will analyse the points that come in from the submissions, and then you'll be given an opportunity, if you've made an original submission, to either indicate a preference and support or an opposition to any points made by other submitters. And that's a unique feature of the RMA process that we're in. And then that will go through sort of the assessment process in preparation for our hearing, which will be mid-year next year. And the hope is that based on the submissions that we can get, a good report can be given both to the council in the sense that they need to get some understanding of the weight of community feedback. But then when it goes into the hearing process, that's when people will have the opportunity to speak to their submission, and the hearing panel will then have to make a recommendation based on all the evidence and all the submissions back to the council prior to this plan change taking any legal effect. And of course it doesn't do that because you do have the right under the Resource Management Act again that anyone who is dissatisfied with the outcome of the council's process does have appeal rights to the Environment Court. But of course that's a situation that none of us really want to get into, so let's hope we can work on it and come up with some good outcomes prior to that. So, Mr. Mayor.
Can I thank Mandy, Dennis and Rachel for their presentation. I want to identify Paul over here and Stephen over here. I really want the questions to be by microphone because that's going to be the only way that everybody can hear it. And so keep your hand up and I'll get them to come across, and then I'll try and direct the question who's best to answer those. I'm going to start with the lady in the third row, please, if you could just stretch over and have the microphone. And Paul, if you could identify the next person so we can make this as pithy as possible. Madam.
Thank you, Mayor Nick. We live in the small area of the Tahunanui Hills, which has been designated as high density. It is a minuscule site bordered by a main road with a school, with slips in even every little heavy rain that occurs onto the road. And many of us have spent a lot of money complying with the current council regulations, throwing money at geotech, at council checking of the geotech.
Can you come to the question? We're going to have an
And
opportunity.
what I would like to know is,
Yes.
what is the rationale for such a small area which is going to impact so many new houses built by people that have spent a lot of money complying with geotech and council regulations?
Good question. One slip up I'd just like to have is, and no trouble with you, madame, is if when people ask their question, to say their name, if they wish, the area of town they represent, and also, and you've done that for us, and also if you represent an organisation to do so. I'm going to ask Rachel to come forward and address that specific question about that area of Tahunanui.
Thanks for the question. So it's really as I was outlining before. So the high density area in Tahunanui, it's really about its accessibility to the centre and all of the services that are around that. But as I say, we recognise that the topography in that area is challenging, and I think you've touched on some of those points. So we're really keen to hear from you in your submission, and we'll look at that really carefully. Yep.
Sir.
Hi, Hamish Barker. Live in Nelson South in the proposed high density area. I asked this question at the professionals meeting the other day as to what exactly was the criteria used for defining the new proposed recession planes. The existing recession planes, the daylight angles that is, are defined apparently in RER 335 as attempting to give 2 hours of sunlight around midday in midwinter, or 2.75 hours during the day between, I think it said 9 and 3 or 10 and 4, something like that. And I didn't get an answer nor to email as to what was the criteria that had been used to select the 12 metres plus 60 degrees up to 19 metres height limit for the new high density zone, because it appears to me that there's all this talk about very few of these tall buildings will be built, but where's the justice for someone who ends up in the shadow of such a building, which will be in permanent shadow in the winter months?
So, Rachel, question is around that specific criteria that was used on the daylight angles and the portion of sunshine.
So just in terms of that question, I know we had a good discussion about that last week, I think it was. So just to be upfront, there was no specific metric in terms of the hours of sunlight received to an adjoining property. That becomes very challenging in a high density residential environment where up to 6-storey buildings are enabled or intended to be enabled. But what I would say is 4 or more residential units, as I mentioned before, would need to go through a resource consent process, a couple of things actually. And as part of that resource consent process, consideration would be given to how and where that building was placed on the site in order to provide opportunities for sunlight access to neighbouring sites. The other thing that I would mention is the development controls in terms of the height in relation to boundary. The more generous height in relation to boundary is enabled within the first 23 metres of the site frontage, and the intention of that is to really encourage the majority of the building bulk, if I can use that word, to the front portion of the site, to front the street, where a building can benefit from the outlook and amenity that the street offers, with a lower level of development enabled to the rear of the site. And that's really consistent with this idea of a perimeter block style of development.
So is the criteria then 0 hours of sunlight?
As I say, there's been no specific criteria set, but what I would say is every site is different, and every site is a different orientation. So that presents some challenges to that, but it would be assessed through a resource consent process.
We need to be very open about the fact that as you allow higher buildings, there is more shading. And if you don't want that, you should submit for lower. And the closer the buildings are to the boundary, the more shading there is. I have a question down here, Stephen.
Thank you. My name is Alison. I am not here representing anybody other than myself. Does council have a threshold for a carrying capacity or a measurement for a carrying capacity for both land, air, water, quality of all of those? Because this Plan 29 is looking to account for growth, but how does Plan 29 actually interact with a carrying capacity?
Okay, that's one for Dennis.
I guess the straight answer is we didn't assess it in terms of carrying capacity as such. But what we have done is we've looked at the ability of the land to sustain the level of development which is contemplated, both in terms of infrastructure servicing, in terms of connection to transport services, as also mentioned in terms of location to our centres. So we've sort of tried to identify the intensification opportunities using those sorts of criteria, if you like, which can be sort of like carrying capacity, but not in strictly that term.
Thank you. Question with Paul. Sir.
My name is Wes Staten. I'm a very recent new resident of the Wood, so some of you might be saying, why is he standing here? What's he got to worry about? But my question really has to do with what's not in the plan. If I understand the plan, and there was a question and answer on your website saying, why are places like the Wood and the Maitai Valley not included in this? And the answer that I gleaned from that was that these are areas that are likely to be inundated by flooding, climate change induced levels of sea level rises. Am I to assume then that the council is sort of capitulating to say, well, we can't do anything about those, and so there is no remedy or anything in the plan to save those areas? Because I think actually if you lost the Wood to an inundation of flood, you have a serious population problem in Nelson. It's all new.
Let me give an overview and then I'll ask planning staff. The reason areas that have some risk of inundation under the very high risk of climate change, sea level rise, is because the government has announced that it's going to have specific legislation for dealing with the adaptation of climate change. And so what the council has said with Plan Change 29 is the areas that might be affected by that new legislation will deal with that legislation proposed at some time in the next 12, 18 months. And both political parties have said we need new legislation for dealing with the issue of adaptation and sea level rise. And so the council said for those areas, we're going to wait to make decisions until we've got that new legislation and guidance. I'd be happy for Mandy or other staff to add to that.
And so just to complete what the Mayor said, because he's quite right, but that means the current status quo rules will apply for those areas that haven't been upzoned. So basically the existing rules will continue to apply to those areas that aren't presented with the intensification opportunity.
Again, just to be clear, those areas that are affected by inundation is status quo with the current rules till that new legislation. Back to Stephen. Madam.
Hi, I'm Sarah Holman. I'm representing myself, but
Madam, Sarah, the floor is yours.
I'm Sarah Holman. I'm representing myself, but in the past I have been part of a group called the Nelson Heritage Advisory Group, which was actually initiated by the council. My concern, as well as the intensification proposals, is the effect on the character and heritage of Nelson. It hasn't been talked about very much tonight, but there are quite a number of deletions of historic properties on this list, and the Heritage Precinct in the inner city and Wakefield Quay, with just one addition of Richmond Avenue as a heritage precinct, which I support. I'm really concerned that the intensification will lead to unintended and intended consequences of the removal of heritage. And I guess my question would be, would the council be prepared to have a second opinion on the heritage assessment list which has been carried out, which has resulted in a very high number of deletions of historic properties and precincts?
Good question, Sarah. In answering that, I'm going to ask Dennis to give a bit more information about those heritage provisions that we run over a little bit short in the presentation because we weren't sure where the strong areas of interest. So, Dennis.
Might need Mithrin for that one. Well, I think to answer your question is, yes, we want to actually hear about your views on whether we've taken too much out or whether we've put too much in. But again, the supporting documents, we do have assessments of the properties which have been deleted from the heritage schedule. So I guess if there are people out there who don't accept the reasoning or the justification for that, then we will hear from you through the submission process. But yeah, that's some of them actually have been deleted because they have actually been modified by their building owners, so they don't actually have the heritage features or values that were present when they were actually originally added to the list. But yes, in terms of the new sites, if you think they are wrong, then we want to hear from you as well. Yep, I think that's the answer.
So to be clear, some heritage added, some taken out. Really keen to hear from you which ones should be added in that weren't, or ones that have been taken out that have not. Over to your side, Paul. Madam.
Thank you, Mayor. My name's Ali. I'm just here for Nelson, nowhere in particular. Sorry about the croaks. I think we're all aware of the fact that modelling has been used in order to estimate the potential growth of the population, and that this is a response to that modelling. I think we're also all aware that in recent years modelling has been used to predict numerous perceived disasters in our country and around the world, such as climate change, such as the COVID disaster, and that the modelling appears to show that it is wildly inaccurate. and has not actually turned out the way that these experts have predicted it to be. So my question is, where has that modelling come from? Where are the numbers? And why do you hold such faith in that modelling to propose such another knee-jerk reaction to a potential situation that may or may not occur?
I can partly answer your question. I'll get Rachel to do so. So at the core of it is, what do we think is going to happen to the population of Nelson? We mainly rely on the forecasts of Stats New Zealand. They're always, no matter who forecasts, they always get it a bit wrong. But if you ask me honestly as Mayor, I've been elected representative for this community for 30 years. Over that period, I've seen the population grow by between 1 and 2,000 pretty consistently right through, and a prudent council would be wanting to look forward, suggesting, well, actually, there is no good reason to suggest the population will not continue to increase over the next 20, 30 years as it has over the last 20, 30 years. But the bit I agree with you, no matter what the projection is, it will be a bit wrong. We're going to get some new, more accurate data out of the census that was conducted this year. We're expecting to get that in February, and that will further inform the council as to whether we've been too ambitious or not ambitious enough. But I'm happy to get Rachel, who's done some of the detailed work, to give you a bit more information.
Just to add to that, yes, and confirming it's all based on Statistics New Zealand information in terms of the demand projections. Those are currently being reviewed and updated, and that is something that's done regularly. But the one thing I would say is the demand numbers are a part of this puzzle. The other part of it is this National Policy Statement on Urban Development that I was talking about earlier. Does provide some guidance on where we locate heights and densities relative to an area's accessibility. So that's been a really key driver in the zoning pattern that I've taken you through, and that's something that's a bit separate in terms of an idea from the demand numbers. So it's really those two things coming together which have informed this zoning plan.
Again, so I can be clear, government regulation requires the council to follow Stats New Zealand population increase, but may be equally clear, it is for the council to decide where that growth in population, how much increased density, how much greenfields, that's very much a judgment that the council gets to make, but we have to meet that legal test for population growth. Over this side again.
John Fitch at Examiner Street. A lot of the blame on the website for having this high density is put on the future development strategy agreed between Tasman and Nelson. Could someone at the top explain as to whether anywhere in that report there is any reference whatsoever to 4, 5 or 6-storey buildings? And don't refer to Appendix 9.
John, I have a copy of the future development strategy here. I'm happy for anybody to have a copy of it. It was prior to my being elected mayor. It was approved by council in September 2002. I can refer to very similar maps to what you've seen tonight, and they refer to those areas. Intensification area, 4 to 6 stories, 3 stories. I'm more than happy to everybody have a copy of that document. Sorry? Yes, look, John, come up and grab it and have a look at it. Because in my view, and I've had a careful check back over it, I'll get Paul to drop it down to you.
My reading says where there is commercial on the ground floor.
No, that's certainly, and I've read the document from back to front as part of my homework for Mayor. Can I tell you something that I do think has happened? The previous council put a huge amount of work with Tasman into the future development strategy. That future development strategy clearly identified on maps where there would be 6 stories, where there would be 3 stories. But the public was very much focused on the high-level debate of things like the Maitai Valley and what the balance was between Nelson and Tasman. And I think the community is genuinely surprised and is a long way behind where the council has been with that strategy in the detail. And that's why there's so many of you here tonight. And I also have been surprised even though there was a lot of consultation, a lot of submissions, I've been surprised by what was in that future development strategy and agreed after consultation. Over the side, Paul.
Kia ora, Mayor Nick and councillors and officers for coming. Thank you for the meeting tonight. I'm Lindsay Wood from Climate Strategy Company Resilience Limited, and we've heard tonight about this housing being a bit of a wicked problem. There are people concerned here. We've heard about the challenges of growth, the challenges of building. There's another wicked problem, and that is that we're in a city that's declared a climate emergency. And a couple of things that go with that is that greenfield development is anathema to good climate planning, point one. Point two is we have no idea generally how to build our buildings with anything like a low enough carbon to be compatible with our Paris obligations. The Building Research Association is strong on that.
Question, please.
I would like to know how the development of this plan proposes to reconcile the mismatch between our current building capability and our need to be responsible in terms of climate responsibility.
Mandy, who would like to... Would you like to have a...
Kia ora, Coralie Barker, Planning Department. So the responsibility for how we build and what materials we build out of and what carbon and how the environment is protected while we are doing building is the responsibility of the Building Act. So there are two separate pieces of legislation that overlap significantly in this scenario, but the plan that we are preparing a change for is being done under the RMA, so the Resource Management Act. We are not in the position to change the requirements of the Building Act, but I do understand that the government is looking into carbon and how our buildings will be going forward. But at this stage, that's something that's definitely beyond the scope of our council plan and the RMA. They try to keep them very separate.
One extra in that area is council is working with the Nelson Environment Centre on a big area of carbon waste in the waste products from building and making sure we recycle a lot more of that, and we hope to make an announcement before the end of this year. Next question down the back there, please, Stephen.
Good evening, my name's Yolan Bloxham and I live in Stoke, where we're in a medium density area. I'm absolutely heartbroken that someone may build a 3-storey building next to my house that I've worked really hard for. But my question is, has all the infrastructure been taken into account? You're bringing more and more people into the area. We've got a hospital that can't cope with the people that we have now, and the roads are atrocious, and you're going to bring more and more people into a small area. Has that been taken into account?
The first thing with the infrastructure, if somebody wants to do a development and they need that consent when they go to the council will not approve it to proceed unless the infrastructure is up to standard. Often they'll say to the developer, if you want to go ahead with that development, you're going to have to pay maybe $1 million to upgrade the infrastructure for it to be there. With respect to the bigger community infrastructure like the hospital, like our roads, then we are all the time investing in upgrading of those. In fact, actually one of the most important projects for our region is the $1 billion upgrade to increase our hospital capacity by 130 beds. Dennis, did you want to add?
Hospital staff is what you need.
We need both, but as the population grows, we need all of that. Next question, can I just get the Paul over here?
Hi, Vanya Smythe, reasonably new to Nelson, 5 years, 2 years owning a house right next door to the oldest house in Nelson. I share a boundary with them, and I think it's one of the most beautiful places in New Zealand. And you've zoned virtually the whole area around Manuka Street and Niles Street. These beautiful old houses. There's high density. I just don't understand the logic of bringing all these people into a high density area like that. destroying one of the most beautiful places I've ever lived in the world, and I've lived all around the world. It just doesn't make sense to me. You're going to destroy all those old villas. I mean, our house alone was built in the 1930s. What's the rationale behind that? Why not just
I've got your question.
let things develop slowly as they have done? I didn't come here to have a 6-storey building right blocking my northern sun. My house was built in the 1930s. You know,
Yes.
if I sell it, the oldest house in New Zealand will get no sun.
Sir,
Ever. Not 2 hours a day.
got your question? What's the rationale?
What's your rationale behind
What's the rationale for zoning an area around Manuka Street where there are heritage homes as high density?
So just to answer that one, there's probably a couple of things in there. The first thing, again, it goes back to this idea of accessibility and the area that you're talking about being very highly accessible to the city centre, the employment, open spaces and amenities that offers, which, as I mentioned, that national policy statement on urban development is really driving us towards enabling more density in those sorts of locations. But it just... Yep.
This accessibility. I can walk into the city in 7 minutes on foot. But why is it not acceptable to drive half an hour or 20 minutes?
We can't hear.
Yeah, we're looking.
It's a talk about accessibility. I can walk into the centre of the city in 7 minutes. That's why I've chosen to live here. I mean, you're going to pack thousands of people into the area that I've chosen to live in, especially. You know, but why not allow for people to drive for half an hour, which by the scale of how people commute in the world, is this based on the idea of having, you know, everybody on bikes?
It's partly related to that, yes.
And on foot, so it's based on climate change modelling, is it?
No, it's related to...
15-minute cities, is it? Is it that stuff? That crap. This is bullshit.
Okay, should we move, should we move on?
Look, I really want to only have a couple more minutes of people who have got questions that are trying to get information, and then you're going to have a free floor to be able to express information. So I'm really looking, Paul, Stephen, really looking for questions so that everybody can be better informed about what's proposed. Many people are trying to frame their questions as a way of expressing a view, and there will be opportunity for that.
Hi, my name is Nicola. I live in an area that's medium density on one side, proposed medium density on one side and high density on the other side of the street. So we've lived in that area for 8 years, and I'd say probably at least 4 or 5 times in that 8 years we've had either sewage or stormwater bubble up through our street because the ageing infrastructure is not able to cope with what's currently in that area. And so my concern and my question is, if we have 3-storey 3 units on our side and 6-storey 6 units on the other side of the street, how will the infrastructure of the sewage and stormwater cope with all those additional toilets and showers and drains and storms and all those things?
Sure. I'll ask Dennis to ask in detail. The piece I can give you, council spends about $40 million a year on new infrastructure. Just because you might be able to build 3 stories in an area, you still have to get the council to approve it, and they will not approve it unless the infrastructure, the water and the sewage is up to standard. The further part is that the government has provided assistance to council, and we have a major project in the CBD where intensive development is proposed, where we'll be spending over $80 million on big infrastructure upgrade. But the short answer is, even if it's zoned, it can't be built unless either the council has built the infrastructure or that developer is going to build that infrastructure. Dennis, did you want to add to that?
Now, the Mayor has actually covered it quite well, very well. The additional point is that quite often with these sort of multi-storey developments, there will be a subdivision, because each of the units will be given a sort of a separate title, a unit title, or whatever the legal process is, and that also triggers a conversation with the developer to ensure that the infrastructure is fit for purpose.
A question, a supplementary question. If you want to make a comment, I'm going to give a chance for that.
So how would you know what's under the street?
Oh, I tell you, a council can tell me what piece of pipe, if you want to come into the council and see our IT system on where the sewage pipes are, where the water pipes are, the information systems there are very extensive, and I've seen them in person. I'm a nerdy engineer who enjoys that stuff. Now, your point is absolutely correct. In many of the areas that are zoned for higher density do not currently have the infrastructure for the level of housing. That is true. But that is why there's that check that it cannot proceed unless both those boxes are ticked. I'm going to come over this side for the last question, and then I'm going to move over to a comment section.
Hi, my name's Graham O'Brien. I'm here representing the democratic process, or lack of it as such. You said that it's the biggest changes in 25 years for the standards, but you give us a measly 5 weeks to digest a document that's 1,000 pages long. There's 1,000 pages of supplementary material. Now, the other day in council, the CEO had the nerve to say that even if we give him 100 days, will we get any better submissions or better quality? Well, I'd actually like to take him up on that challenge, and I'd like to ask for 100 more days of submission time so that people can get their head around this massive document. And if everyone thinks 100 days, please put your hand up. 100 days, what do you reckon? There you go. The vote's been taken. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure where the question was, but let me give you assurance of this. The council is very open to extending
100 days extra submission time for the people to get their head around.
The council is open-minded about extending the submissions, and when we come to the end of the meeting, I am going to ask for some indications of show of hands, and I'll give you some indications of decisions on those issues. Next question. Sorry, I did say if we could just move the mics now. To enable the meeting to move on, I am now opening anybody to make comments. Let me just tell you the rules.
Are you able to extend this closing of submissions date from the 19th of September for another 2 weeks, 100 days?
Yes, and that is being actively considered. One of the reasons I wanted to call the public meeting as quickly as possible was to get feedback so that the council might be able to extend that period if that was the public's wish. Now, on the comment session, I would ask people to limit their comments to 3 minutes. Why? Because we want as many people as possible to be able to comment. There will be one bell at 2.5 minutes and a full bell at 2 minutes. If you agree with what the person said, feel free to applause. If you don't, I'd prefer you remain silent so we can get through as many as possible, and we're starting over this corner here.
Excuse me, I'd like to speak.
Well, no, I'll determine who speaks. I'll ensure, sir, I will ensure that you are the next speaker after the person I've called here, out of the courtesy that I've given to this person to give the microphone, and I'll take you next, sir. Madam.
Thanks, Nick. My name's Annie, I'm from Nelson. My big concern is I don't see what council's doing to help provide affordable accommodation, because we just know that the developers will come in and the prices, because of all the things that they will have to do to be able to build, will go up and up and up, and it will still be left with a very large percentage of people who are already unable to afford their homes or affordable rent in a home.
Gentleman here, correct? Your opportunity, sir. 3 minutes, the floor is yours.
No, I'm sorry, I'm going to say you're trying to communicate stuff to us, you're trying to control the meeting. There are people here who want to ask you questions, and that's what you do in a consultative process, but you haven't had a consultative process. You've developed a 1,200-page document and thrown it out to the community, and your planning man says, get up and make a submission. We don't want to make submissions. We want the thing to be right when it goes out to the community for us to make comment on it and not be controlled by the council bureaucrats who are just forcing us all into a situation where we've got to make a submission to get anywhere.
Next, can we have the microphone? There's quite a group up the front here, Paul, that have had their hands up for some time. Yes, go for her, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Jean. I'm from Te Hunanui. I have a real concern that medium density and low density areas have had removed resource consent so that we have no further input into whatever is going to go up beside us.
Thank you, Madam. Next.
Thank you. My name's Kay and I'm from Rocking Street. Hello, Nick. I just want to know why anyone in Nelson under the medium density or even the general density area would invest in solar if a 3-storey house can go up next to them, or a 6-storey.
Now, up the... Sir, Mike's yours.
Yeah, hi, I'm Murray, property in the Wood. The question is around the general area. You've got general, you've got the medium, and then you've got the high density. The lady, sorry, names, mentioned that up to 4 residential units before you get to RMA requirement. Is that still relevant to the general residential area?
3.
Okay.
3. So in a general residential area, you can build up to 3 homes on that property, but of course there are other rules as well to be able to do that.
Okay, so
3.
You're essentially encouraging people on the normal general residential zones to be able to put 3 properties on there. So as far as like a normal house now, even the low density is going to be 3 per unit as one. And just to finish and let you go.
Yeah.
So you talk about the RMA and requiring for the RMA, but that's a great political hot potato of whether it's going to remain in any form or other. You're referring to RMA. If the RMA gets changed, does this whole thing get changed as well?
Just for information, the Resource Management Act has been repealed and replaced by the Natural Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act. The National Opposition has said that they would repeal that and go back to the old Act. That is uncertain, but the key thing is under either of those acts, you still need all of these planning rules. Yes, it is change, but you've still got to have a plan and you've still got to have these rules about how many houses you can build and how high you can go. I'm sorry if I've answered the question, but I wanted the meeting to have clarity on that point, and we'll come to this lady.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I was just wondering if it's very clear that, given what was said over here before about 6 stories on one side and 3 stories on another, that doesn't necessarily make it clear how many residential units will be on each story.
Correct.
And how many people it's proposed that one 6-story block might occupy that site, and given there's no car parking with anything new. I'm just wondering if the council's made it clear enough the anticipated numbers they see coming into this high density housing, because it's not just height, it's how many residential units might be in that one block.
More of a question on top of that. On the parking, the government has passed legislation that specifically prohibits the council from being able to require parking requirements. On the number of units that are allowed on each floor, there are minimum apartment numbers, minimum areas, but of course every site's going to be different. So on one building it might be a really big site with just 2 stories. It's the area of the units, each residential unit, that is limited in the proposed plan. Next. Where's the microphone? Paul, right down the back.
G'day mate, it's Dwayne Whiting. I represent myself and several development companies that I'm involved with. My point is around the slap hazard, broadleaf, slope stability zoning that you guys have put in place on the zoning maps. And the question to the council that they need to think about is, why haven't they taken into account the thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been spent on geotechnical reports for people's sections? And I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room that have geotechnical reports on their sections and their houses that is going to affect them with their insurance and their saleability of the house because it hasn't been looked at as it should be.
A quick response. At council next week, I'm going to be recommending to councillors that they take millions of dollars of money off you to try and help people whose homes got wrecked because of landslides last August. And I make no apologies to this meeting that I want better rules in the plans so there aren't as many properties that are wrecked in the next storm, of which I've got to rate you even more money. Now, if there are concerns about specific properties that have been identified, and you've got a geotech report to say that the staff do not have those landslide risk areas correct, please give us the detail and we'll change it. But it is my view, if I'm going to look after your ratepayer money, we do not want houses being built in areas that are going to collapse in the next storm and of which you're going to have to pay the rates to fix. Paul, next person. Oh, sorry, Stephen.
Nick Kevin Gardner. I want to know why this council's treating ratepayers and the people that pay the bills like mushrooms. I had the misfortune to go into the dying retail city that we call Nelson, and I went to the council offices to get some written information on Plan 29. There's nothing. All there is submission forms. There's no written information. Oh, you have to go to a website. I believe this is all secret society stuff that is not coming out to the ratepayer.
There are paper copies at all of the libraries. It is a very thick document, and I appreciate and hear the message about too much of it being in electronic form.
Thank you. My name is Nettie and my expertise is in urban sociology. I looked in vain for a comprehensive professional scientific analysis of social impact assessment on this project as you did in 2010 for the alternative transport routes. Would the panel please outline the social impact assessment analysis that's been carried on these most significant and biggest plan changes that the council has ever done? If this has not been done, why not? It is my contention that to satisfy the requirements of the RMA and the Enabling Housing Supply and Other Amendment Act 2021 to allow for a well-functioning urban environment that enables all people and communities to provide for their social, economic and cultural well-being and for their health and safety now and the future, which is the requirement, I suggest that the absolute minimum required for a meaningful consultation process would be at least to repeat the social assessment analysis on this one. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. My name's Blair Cameron. I'm the National Party candidate for Nelson, but I'm here as myself, not on behalf of the National Party. I live on a 6-storey apartment building on Wakefield Quay, so I'm not personally affected by this, but I can tell you that I've knocked on 3,500 doors in the last few weeks, and the overwhelming feeling in the community is that this has been sprung on people, that there has not been enough consultation, and I absolutely implore you to extend the submission period so that people have more time to understand these changes, how it will affect them, and we need to have that submission period extended. Now, we do have a housing crisis in Nelson, and so I congratulate you on taking some steps to do that. The average rent in Nelson has increased by $7,800 per year in the last 6 years. We have people living in motels. I've met people living in cars. We absolutely need more housing. We need more housing intensification. You know, I live in a 6-storey apartment building. It's great. But we need to do it in places where it makes sense. Places like the CBD, places like, well, we have these new bus routes. If you can walk outside the 6-storey apartment building onto a public bus into the town centre, that is fantastic. But I ask that you do these, the intensification in a much more considered, much more purposeful way, so that we have those buildings going up in places where it makes sense and not willy-nilly across the community where it's going to have really big impacts on people's livelihoods, people's neighbourhoods and on our community. And just one thing before I shut up, I wanted to just correct you on National Party policy that you mentioned before. We're going to replace the RMA, not just go back to the old RMA. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul. He's much better than the last chat they had for the National Party.
Kia ora everybody. My name's Harry Pearson. I just got a couple of quick questions that I didn't get a chance to ask before, but I'm not expecting an answer tonight. I just wanted to state them out publicly. I noticed in the Nelson City Central area there's a high density zone that is not surrounded by a medium density zone like the Stoke area is. The Stoke area seems to be a much better planned area, and I question why you'd have high density buildings next to single story buildings close to the city centre. The second question was, according to the documents, it appears that the hearing panel is going to be comprised of 3 people, 2 of them council representatives and 1 independent. So I don't know, my maths tells me that that hearing panel is going to be controlled by the council and not by the community. And lastly, what I did really want to talk about, just briefly, I live in Tanaki Street in Te Hunanui. A 6-storey, if this plan goes ahead, a 6-storey building could be put up next to me. Now, Nick Smith mentioned at the start that we want the right rules in the right place. Right. Now, it is obvious to the majority of us here that the right rules or the right plans are not in the right place, and I think the council needs to go back to the drawing board and revise this plan and not waste all our time doing submissions, even if we've got 100 days to do those submissions. Come out with a decent plan that most of us can agree with and then do submissions on that. How much money is the council going to waste reading our submissions? How much time are we going to waste having to do the submissions? The Te Hunan Hills is not suitable for 6-storey buildings because of stability. There's a main highway separating the community from the community services, and there is really crap infrastructure that is at full capacity. Thank you very much for listening.
Can I just address one issue that Harry raised, and I am open-minded about it. The council decided to have an independent chair, a Mr. Greg Hill, who's previously chaired organisations, and 2 councillors, Rohan O'Neill-Stevens and Trudy Brand, on hearing the submissions panel. Some people have argued that they should all be independent professionals, right? My honest view to you, having previously been a minister, is that of this area, is that in my experience, your elected members are going to be far more responsive to community concerns than the technical experts who tend to be far more academic and legalistic about it. So I am open-minded, but I do say to you that if we take elected representatives of the panel, I think you're more likely to get a very technical, legalistic decision rather than a decision that your community would feel more comfortable with, but I'm happy to hear your views. Madam.
Okay, my name's Jan Whittington, I live in Nelson South, and I've got a little point to make about the process. So all discussions around how valid the arrangement currently is aside, I would like to encourage every single one of you in this room, bar none, to submit. If you don't make a submission, you won't have any say on what goes on. And if you don't make a submission and there's further discussions, you won't get any further into the process. You'll be locked out forever. So I really encourage you all to submit. And the other thing I'd like to say is that I spoke to a lot of professionals who are both current and past associations with this general subject. And one of the things that one of them said to me was that you put your submission in, you can itemise what you think, but if you haven't included every last thing that they may well consider in future, you don't get a say in that either. So they suggested that you start off with, I 100% reject this plan, but if you're going to do it, These are the things I'd like you to consider, and I would like you, if nothing else tonight, you remember to do that and you get your piece of paper out of your laptop and you make a submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.
Nick, hi, Nolene, Independent. Nick, good decisions are based on sound evidence and data. 2018 is the most reliable last census. 2021, forget it. 2000, and this current one, 75% of the country replied. Good luck finding stable decisions from that stuff. Way back in 2018, Stoke population was due to rise by 18%. Nelson was only 5%. The growth in the area is coming to Richmond. So, I'm getting a bit sceptical here. Are you planning to build old age retirement villages in Nelson and Stoke because the 80% rise is going to be over the 65-year-olds, i.e. retirees? A bit sceptical. So I said, you know, okay, you're relying on statistics from the government. Good luck. How reliable they are, good luck. That's all I can say.
One of the, and your point is a fair one. My colleague Tim King argues, as does Tasman, that at the moment 3 times the population growth is in their area rather than ours. And they say, and many people have spoken to me and said, Nick, we cannot just go on consuming the good horticultural lands of the Waimea Plains for housing. The Tasman Council argues that very strongly. They point the finger at us and they say, you need to do your share in Nelson of coping with population growth. And that is one of the things that has driven the changes. Yes, yeah, let's have a word from a young person.
Hello, I'm Trace, and I've worn this in Nelson 17 years, and I just like to say as a young person in the crowd, there's definitely a key demographic that I'm seeing, but I brought along my friends so that we could hear and just make our own judgments of seeing what's happening out here, and I'd like to say that from what I've gathered so far, that I think, well, I agree that a change is needed in the area, definitely, to bring more houses. It's very clear that in more time, the community agrees that more submissions should be made, and I implore everyone, as this lovely woman said, to make your submissions as much as possible, because I think that to get a good plan, we need submissions, and we need more and more changes, submissions, revisions. Yeah, thank you.
Madam, down the back and then here.
Yeah, I'm Chris from Nelson South. First couple of points, we don't actually have a huge housing problem in New Zealand. If Kaingaora would have some of their houses more habitated, would be really good. Currently there's a few of them sitting around empty and have been for quite a while. There's also a lot of holiday homes in Nelson that are empty majority of the time. So if we took care of that, we actually wouldn't need quite so many houses. I would also like to say that I'm a little surprised that you're discounting the wood at the moment. If there's a whole lot of houses that are soon going to be inundated by water, that seems like the most logical place to develop. It's close to a lot of the services, stormwater and sewage. If you raise the ground in that area, rather than going house by house, you actually develop a large area of the wood, take out some of the areas where there's a lot of older houses currently, and then you develop a whole area, and rather than just having one section with 3 or 4 houses, whatever it's going to be, demolish a whole area of houses and build in them a big park with houses around them, and then a green strip around there, and then no one has any real issues with shading. That's my point.
Thank you.
My name's Gwen, and my name's Gwen. I've been watching our coastline and acting on it in many ways for over half a century. And I can say that Mayor Nick has recent comment just suggests that there are limits to growth. And one that I know of for sure is that raw sewage periodically has to go directly into our coastal zone, and the resource consents for doing this are sometimes retroactive, and each year we have to apply for resource consent for discharging. So we have a sewage system which perhaps is limiting to our growth, and until we start thinking in terms of limits to growth, then we're in big trouble.
I have another question, totally different. In the last couple of years, some large, I understand, just flimsy sheds have been put up in central Nelson, Rebel Sports Warehouse, and those buildings, prime places for, in fact, a high rise. And I wonder if it's possible to expect or in any way change those areas so that they can be multiple story.
Thank you. I'll take right down the back with Paul, please.
Thanks, Annelie here. When are you growing up a backbone and stop hiding behind central government directive and go, no, this is not suitable for Nelson?
My simple view as Mayor, and whether you like it or not, if you are a lawmaker, you follow the law. And so if you want to change the law, you've got decisions to make on the 14th of October. But for as long as I am your Mayor, I will be ensuring the council follows the law. How can I ask you to follow the law if public bodies like councils and mayors do not follow the law?
My name's Jeff Cooper. I will applaud everybody for coming tonight, and all the councillors and you, Nick, too, all the experts. But I have a question for you and the council. How confident should I be that you and the council and the experts will take any notice on what people say, all their submissions that they make, because the last issue that I took part in opposing was at Kaka Valley, and as far as I understand, there were 13,000 signatures. There were hundreds of submissions. I'm open to be corrected on that, but the council just went ahead and did it anyway, and apparently the council has given money for that infrastructure to cut the costs for the developer. That is what I have understood. But how confident should I be that you're going to listen to what people want?
I'm going to comprehensively answer your question. And I think it's important for the public to understand the stages. The submissions come in, the council officers produce a report on the summary of those submissions. Then every one of you that have submitted then get a second opportunity to then comment on what other people have said. Then the panel hears all that information, has formal hearings, so you can say, I want to be heard, and that panel hears you in person as well as in writing. Then that panel makes a recommendation back to the council. Here's my assurance for you, sir. I, as Mayor, will not support a plan that comes back from that panel unless I am satisfied that Nelsonians have been listened to and the majority of people support its content. And if it does not meet that test, I will try, it will ultimately be a decision for council, to refer that back until that is achieved. That's my commitment to you, sir. The second thing you say about the Maitai Valley, the Maitai Valley decision was made by 3 completely professional independent commissioners. None of them were elected representatives. Why have I recommended to council that you have elected representatives on the panel? Because my view is that elected representatives are more in touch and better know our local community. That is why I think it is a good thing that you've got elected members on the panel. Third question, the council is not using your ratepayer money to fund any of the infrastructure for the Mai Tai development. But what does take place is that we have to be able to charge them for that infrastructure. We need to put it in our annual plan and say how much it is so that we can then charge them the development contribution. But the rules that our council applies is that if you're doing a development that requires infrastructure, you pay for it, not the general ratepayer. Yes?
Thank you for your reply. But I'm aware, I believe it's true, that there was a going to the community about development up the Mai Tai Valley in Kaka years ago, many years ago. Some people may remember that, and there was a resounding no, don't do it. And I believe the council did change its mind on that.
Yes, before I was elected as mayor, the council voted to approve the plan change in the Mai Tai. But whether you're for or against the Mai Tai, can I tell you there's an issue that this community cannot walk away from. If you say that you're not going to have any development in greenfields, because we want to protect the productive land out in Richmond, and you don't want any development in areas of farmland like in the Mai Tai, and you don't want any stories going up, then there's nowhere for housing, and housing is simple supply and demand. My children, these young people here, will never have the opportunity to be able to own a home. And so I challenge this community and say, just saying no to the Mai Tai, no to productive land in Richmond, and no intensification is not going to work for the future of this town. We have to resolve what that right balance is. I'm not saying the balance is right in Plan Change 29, but I'm saying we do need to lay out new housing somewhere.
It's, sorry, the infrastructure just keeps coming over and over and over again. You're blaming it on or putting the emphasis or responsibility on the developers. I think you're still avoiding the issue in that the central area, for argument's sake, infrastructure at the moment, we've got all that obvious with sewer and water or whatever, but the roading and getting in and out of Nelson is an absolute flaming nightmare. That's got to be the council's responsibility. You're talking about multi-storey car parks in the centre. There's somewhere, if you actually can get into the city, that you can actually park. And we look at, for argument's sake, just this evening, we used to have a whole lot of car parks out here, and now there's hardly any. I mean, come on, you guys have got to set the goal here. You've got to get it going first. You know, you can't blame everyone else. You've got to actually get the ball rolling. Otherwise, none of this can happen.
Thank you, sir. Just the clarity, state highways are the responsibility of central government, either Rachel or Blair or whoever might be the government. Council is responsible for the local roads. Yes.
Sorry, I'm double dipping. It seems to me that we've got a CBD that's a ghost town. At 5 o'clock, everybody leaves, and yet there's 4 or 5 stories above most of our retail outlets that are empty. I know it's been put to council before. Why aren't we utilising buildings that are already there and turning them into much needed housing? My second point would be that I've seen some fairly sympathetic single-storey intensification. I sit in Stoke, on Main Road Stoke, where the old 1,000 square metre section, old dilapidated buildings have been knocked down, and some very nicely created 3 and 4 properties on one section have gone in. It's happened on Vanguard Street as well. They look fantastic. They're all single story and they fit very well into their existing community, so I'm not necessarily convinced we need to go up. My last point is more of a moral one, really. I've heard you say today that it's central government's decision and you're responding to that, and that's your job to uphold the law.
Yes.
And I've heard the same response in regard to the fluoridation of our water.
Yes.
At some point, I feel that the moral person within the political or moral person actually needs to have a voice and say, actually, no, this is not okay. We've heard in the First and Second World Wars the outcome of people that stood there and said, I was just doing my job, and the atrocities that were committed on the people of those places. And for you to stand there and say to me, I'm just doing my job, is a very frightening message to be giving the people of your city.
Madam, I accept your challenge. If I felt that I was being required to pass laws, as you rightly say, in the tragedy of Nazi Germany, I'd resign. But I will not, knowingly, as elected representative, break the law. And if you want a mayor that breaks the law, you need to find another mayor. Yes?
Thank you, Mayor, for the opportunity to talk. There is one option that has not been discussed this evening, and I'm of the view that, did I introduce myself? Sheila Noble, and I am a planner. Hi. Okay. To establish these areas, the main criteria that's being considered is the distance from the CBD. There are a lot of other aspects of intensification which I do support, and I think there needs to be a fine-grained analysis of all those areas to see which are the houses that are old, past their usable life, that might be demolished, which gardens have got rear yards that would lend themselves to additional housing, which big houses would lend themselves to being redeveloped into multiple units, given that more than half of the population live in 1 or 2 person households. Now, I think if all of those aspects were worked through with the community, looking at the specific locations, you actually might find that you get a lot of potential for intensification within the existing plan rules. So what I'm of the opinion that the community is being asked to comment on work that has not been adequately prepared. And there is an option to maybe continue with hazard land change, but there is an option of taking back the intensification 3 zones and doing the work properly, and that's what I would suggest.
Thank you. I'd like to give the floor to Rachel Boyack, Nelson MP.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, and can I just acknowledge that this has, I think, actually been a really useful meeting in terms of people being able to put on the table the concerns that they have. One of the things I do just want to point out is, yes, central government is very much giving communities a nudge around the need for housing development, because we do have a housing crisis across the whole country. One of the things that I think Council has missed a bit of a step on, and would encourage Council to consider going back and doing, is that in the future development strategy it pointed out the need for neighbourhood plans to be made before the plan change. And so what that would have done would have allowed for each neighbourhood to sit down together with council staff in an engagement strategy and actually look at what they wanted their neighbourhood to look like. For the record, I live in the Nelson South area, and my area is proposed for medium density, and there are some areas nearby that would be for 6 stories, and my view is I'd be quite comfortable with medium density in that area, but probably not the 6 stories in that area. Whereas in a city, I think people do understand the need for a higher level of density in the inner city, and that seems to me, from listening to the room, where there seems to be quite a bit of conflict, and some of those more suburban areas going up really high doesn't seem to have support. So I think council really needs to listen to that. We have, as a government, put $36 million into that inner city infrastructure need, and so that is deliberately to allow council to then build up in the inner city. So my plea to council, I guess, would be to go back to what the future development strategy actually said in its instructions to council, sit down with each neighbourhood, and I know that will take some resource, but sit down with each neighbourhood and come up with some neighbourhood plans and then feed that into what the plan change should look like. That's my question on the list.
Thank you, Rachel. Madam.
Hi, I just want to say that we were in horticulture on the Waimea Plains and we really do not want more sprawling houses built out there. So overall I think you've done a great job and I quite like the plan and I know it needs tweaking obviously and maybe a bit more consultation, but if you have more people living in town, might help the dead CBD in town, and you know, people might not have to drive so far if more people could live in town. And personally I'd quite like to live in the central city and we need, you know, it would be nice if there was more housing.
Sir.
My name is Jeff Hayes. I'm a demographer. And the topic of population has been mentioned several times already. So I want to say a few words about population issues in Nelson. Those of you who know the National Policy Statement on urban development will know that councils are required to carry out population projections in order to determine the future demand for housing. And having determined the future demand for housing using a population projection, then to identify land to meet those requirements. Now, the council justifies Plan Change 29 on the grounds that they are attempting to comply with the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. That's fine and good, but how have they gone about this? Now, I'm a former United Nations official, and in the United Nations we always use polite and diplomatic language, even when talking to our enemies. But in the case of Plan Change 29, I feel that I will abandon my diplomatic language and I will use more strenuous words, and I hope no one will take offence at my doing so. Now, the Dean of New Zealand Demography is Professor Ian Paul of the University of Waikato. Unfortunately, recently passed away. And he coined an expression a few years ago that he called dodgy demography. Now, what did he mean by dodgy demography? He meant analyses of population that are not based on the accepted methods of demographers and statisticians, the tried and true demographic methods that have been tested and proven to be reliable. Now, sad to say, the Nelson City Council has engaged in dodgy demography. They are attempting to justify Plan Change 29, as they did with Private Plan Change 28, based on population projections that are seriously flawed. Now, I understand why the council did what they did, because when COVID came, nobody knew what the impact of COVID would be. And so the council in its wisdom said, let's go back and look at economic recessions in the past. For example, the 1930s. What happened in the 1930s to the birth rate and so on and so forth. So they tried to do a projection that included these considerations. Unfortunately, it was very, very clumsy. So the problem is, and I'll finish now because the mayor is signaling me to shut up.
Not quite.
As a former professor, I normally speak only for 45 minutes. I'm concerned, very concerned, and I pointed this out to planners and Nelson City Council, that they need to redo their population projections. Why? Because they're overstating future population growth in Nelson. And if you overstate future population growth in Nelson, then you overstate the need for housing. And if you overstate the need for housing, you come up with this abomination, which is Plan Change 29. Thank you.
Sir, I really encourage you to use your demographic skills and test through the panel process the population assumptions there. They are good points. Down the back.
My name is Carol Ann. I'm from Nelson South. I moved to beautiful Nelson 5 years ago from Auckland, and I've gone through this same process up in Auckland for a 10-year plan, which finished up with a lot of infill housing, and you will no doubt will have been aware of the amount of flooding that has been caused in Auckland because of the number of old houses on large sections that were removed and replaced with multi-stories or terraced housing or whatever, but no provision for green space. And that was a problem in Auckland, was a lot of the areas there was no provision for green space. The green space had all gone because of infill housing, and when we had these torrential rains, 1 in 100 years, which are coming, you know, like 1 every 5 or 10 years, lots of areas were totally flooded out. I'm just wanting to ask you, Mr. Mayor, to make sure that the council and allowing infill housing is taking this into account, because we need to be able to learn from Auckland Council's many mistakes, and I hope that you do. Thank you.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to ensure that there is opportunity for you to be able to talk to myself and the other elected representatives. Would any of our elected councillors like to make any comments before I wrap up tonight's public meeting with some closing comments? Okay. I'm going to conclude the meeting with a bit of an analogy, if you'll bear with me. I had a job to do last Sunday, digging a trench about 15 metres long for a cable in the bottom part of my garden. And in part of it I had to dig it underneath a path that was about 1.5 metres long. And the tools I had just would not do the job. I got super frustrated after about cracking it about 2 hours. I got so bloody grumpy, I stopped the job and went to bed, thought about it overnight. Next day got the right tool from Hire Equip and did the job in 10 minutes. Now, I tell that story because sometimes the solution is to pause and think. I believe the council just to push forward with this plan is not the right approach. I think it needs some fresh thinking. We need to hear the message tonight, and we need to find some new tools to enable better community engagement. The first thing is, I think there is an overwhelming message from this meeting that given the volume of information, the submission time is too short. I hear you. I've checked with the Chief Executive. The close-off date for submissions is currently the 19th of September. I'm announcing this evening that that will be extended to the 31st of October, a period of a further 6 weeks, to the end of October. I think there's a big job, and I know councillors will want to discuss this some further, and that is that there is not, and there's been the opportunity to get out some information this evening, but we've got a job to do to get out a lot more information. The specific commitment that we give you this evening is to have at least 10 community drop-in sessions in different parts of the community, and I do think there's going to need to be some specific engagement around the heritage and with some of those groups during that period, so at least a further 10 community drop-ins to support it. The third is that I do think it's a useful initiative. People become overwhelmed by these submission processes to actually have a professional support you, and that is why we've got a contract between the council and Emily. Subject to her agreeing, I would like our council staff to have Emily's period also extended through to that end of October, so all of you that want to be able to have a say on it can do so. There may be other options that myself and elected councillors want to consider as we go forward. I am just one person around the council table, but I want to say I hear you. Thank you. I had a lady at the market come up to me on Saturday, and it moved me. She was really upset. She had to see a doctor and those things, and I didn't become mayor to upset this community. And so I give you my commitment and the commitment of my fellow councillors that we're going to do everything we can to get this process right and to get a future plan for Nelson that does address the issue of housing, but also listens to you more carefully. Thank you again for every one of you coming to this meeting. I'm now going to ask Councillor Pakipaki to close with a karakia and a blessing of our food.
Kia ora everyone. I get to do the easy part, which is basically bring us to a close, but I'd just like to express my gratitude and thank you for the privilege of being able to hear, and on behalf of my other councillors as well, if I can take that liberty, so thank you all for coming and taking the time to express this too. So ka pai, thank you very much. For those people who weren't here when we started this meeting, I did a karakia that we do with our council. The word is tiakina. Tiakina encompasses and encapsulates the responsibility that we have as kaitiaki, as guardians, to look after our environment, and it reminds us of that. So I'm going to do that karakia and then I will do a quick karakia for our kai so we can get on with our evening, and we can whakatau, we can put this to rest, and then we can think about it tomorrow. We can go to bed all happy. So Tihau mauri ora. Te akina te rangi, te akina te hau. Te akina te maunga, te akina te awa. Te akina te moana, te akina te whai o te ao. Te akina papa tuanuku. Hau mea hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora tātou. Te kai, te karakia kai, auraki mai ngā kono, ki wainganui a tātou, he kai maku, he kai mau, he kai mana. Tihau mauri ora. Kia ora.